It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday morning at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Now, last week we fed on the food of the gods, and this week we battle ecology once again as animals begin to attack an upper-class southern family. But before we get into 1972's Frogs, we've got ourselves a trio of pretty well-known folks right at the top of this cast list. We begin with Ray Milland. Now, Milland was on the back half of his long career at this point, but he was still a pretty respectable actor. He got his career started way back in 1928 as an uncredited extra in that early version of Moulin Rouge. By the second half of the 30s, he was gaining a lot of momentum as a star. In 1937, he made his sole appearance as Bulldog Drummond in Bulldog Drummond Escapes. That same year, he was in Ebb Tide, which was an early Technicolor film. But his career reached its absolute pinnacle with 1945's The Lost Weekend, directed by the great Billy Wilder. In that, he played alcoholic writer Dan Burnham. The film would win him the Best Actor Oscar, as well as 3 more. Best Picture for producer Charles Brackett, Best Director for Wilder and Brackett won the Best Adapted Screenplay Oscar. Side note about The Lost Weekend, it is the first and one of still only 3 films in all of the history of the Cannes Film Festival and the Academy Awards to win the top honors at both events. The other 2, if you're curious, are 1955's Marty and 2019's Parasite. Ray Milland was still a pretty big actor for the following 25 to 30 years after The Lost Weekend. Now, there are a couple of movies of his that I've liked him in from the genre that I deal with most around here. First is 1944's The Uninvited. That's often labeled as the best of the 17 horror films of 1944, and it's also usually noted as the most interesting one as well. But it's a pretty good ghost flick that really does have some eerie stuff in it. It was also nominated for the Best Black and White Cinematography Oscar at that year's Academy Awards. Later in the 60s, Milland also appeared as Dr. James Xavier in the Roger Corman movie X, The Man with the X-Ray Eyes. It's one of the more highly regarded Corman films in his directorial career, right in that sweet spot when he was really kind of in his prime, and that was also during the time he was making the Edgar Allan Poe films that he would be also well known for. Another recognizable star in this is Sam Elliott. Now, we know that guy, and if you don't know his name, you probably know his voice and certainly know his mustache. And I'm pretty sure he's got that deep tenor in his voice because of that cookie duster he has. But anyway, at this time, he was still kind of new and a little bit unknown. He had been in 13 episodes of Mission Impossible prior to Frogs. But really, by the mid-'80s, Elliott would become, if not a big leading star, a very competent supporting actor in several movies, as well as leading several Western TV movies. Most people would probably know him best for his movies like Mask, the one with Cher, Roadhouse, Tombstone, The Big Lebowski. These days, he's also had a splash on TV series, having taken over as Mayor Wild West on Family Guy, and leading the limited run series 1883 as part of the Yellowstone series from Paramount+. And our last recognizable star leading the cast in Frogs is Joan Van Ark. Now, Van Ark didn't appear in too many feature films. She was mostly a TV star, but she was best known for her primetime soap opera work. In particular, she appeared in 8 episodes of Dallas as Valine Ewing, but that spun off into the Dallas spin-off soap opera Knots Landing, where she played Valine for 327 episodes between 1979 and 1993. Most recently, Van Ark appeared as Mrs. Franklin in an episode of Doom Patrol, but that's not all the comic book-related stuff she's done. Way back in 1979, Marvel created a TV animated series for their relatively new character, Spider-Woman. Van Ark was chosen to voice the heroine, alias Jessica Drew, in all 16 episodes of that series. But let's get a little froggy with this 1972 eco-horror film from Canadian director George McCowan. The movie opens with Pickett Smith, who's played by Sam Elliott, taking wildlife photos as he paddles through a swamp. And as he takes the pictures, he begins to focus on garbage that's strewn about the banks and in the water. He then spots some floating gunk before seeing dead animals in the polluted swamp. After an accident where a wealthy brother and sister Clint and Karen Crockett, Joan Van Ark playing Karen Crockett, they basically overturn Pickett's canoe with their motorboat, but they take him back to their family plantation. Now, the plantation is loaded with frogs. When he gets to the house, the phone isn't working, and Karen takes that opportunity to basically introduce him to the rest of the Crockett clan. And they all seem a little cagey with him around, not really expecting a stranger on the plantation. Now, the patriarch of the family, Jason Crockett, which is played by Ray Milland, is an old curmudgeon. He hates when the family is late to meals. He's particularly uneasy around strangers. He's barely able to handle one of his grandsons, Kenneth's guest, an unannounced guest who happens to be a supermodel and black. Remember, they live on a plantation. But Jason is missing one of his workers named Grover since early in the morning. And Grover was sent out to spread some pesticide to rid the plantation of mosquitoes and frogs. He asks Pickett, who is planning on kind of taking a look around at the various kind of weird things that are going on with the animals and the frogs and everything. But he has him go out and see if he can find Grover, and if he does, have him go back to the house to speak with Jason. And as Pickett investigates, he finds the land thick with the poisonous dust and powder stuff that Grover was throwing around, and several animals, not just frogs, are found dead. Soon he finds Grover's body covered in poisonous snakes and surrounded by frogs, and he's been chewed up pretty good by the creepy crawlies. Pickett brings Grover's Jeep back to the house, and he has a word with Jason privately to tell him what he found. And Jason's actually somewhat friendly with Pickett and appreciates that he told him first as opposed to telling anybody else, which could kind of create a little bit of a stir within the family. They discuss what should happen with Grover's body, but they're also interrupted when they hear the frogs trying to get into the doors and the windows by basically throwing themselves against the glass. In addition to that, a dangerous snake has also worked its way into the house and threatens dinner before Jason shoots it. Pickett comments that the frogs and snakes are not normal things, and Jason wants to just get the state to spread some pesticide to rid them of their pest problem. But Pickett thinks that will kill a lot of other animals unnecessarily. And Jason basically tells him that he doesn't really care. After all, in his mind, man is still the master of the world. Karen and Pickett begin to get a little bit closer, and she even admits to him the next morning that after their late night conversation, she considered visiting him in his room. And he's kind of sorry that she didn't, but she says that the floorboards creak a little bit too much at that end of the hall, if you know what I mean. But later that day, Michael, one of Jason's other grandsons, goes out and shoots at birds, and when he accidentally shoots himself in the shin to incapacitate himself, tarantulas descend down onto him and bite him to death. Meanwhile, Michael's brother Kenneth is in the greenhouse getting flowers for the table setting, and a pair of tegus gas him by knocking over bottles of poison off the shelves so that an army of tokay geckos and anoles can swarm over the asphyxiated man. Pickett and Bella find him, Bella being Kenneth's black girlfriend that Jason's a little uneasy around. But soon, frogs begin to invade the land around the plantation and start hopping all over the birthday cake and other fixings that have been set outside for Jason's birthday. And also you have Iris, who is Jason's son, or Jason's daughter, rather, who is really big into butterflies, and she runs off after a rare one so that she can catch it and add it to her collection. She ends up getting scared by a snake and some baby alligators, and she ends up falling into some water where leeches latch onto her. Tired and, just kind of over everything that's been going on, she falls down next to a rattlesnake that bites and kills her. Not long after that, her husband, Stuart, goes looking for her, and he's killed by alligators. So between Stuart, Iris, and their kids, Michael and Kenneth, the entirety of the Martindale bloodline from the Crockett family tree is wiped out in just a few hours. Jason Crockett is not willing to change his birthday and 4th of July plans just because one of his grandkids have died, at least that they know of at this point. Nope, he's wanting everyone to push on like nothing is the matter. However, the hired help, which is his maid and his butler, and Bella intend to get out of there with the help of Clint and his speedboat. But they discover that his boat is adrift after the tether has been gnawed on and cut. He tries to swim out to that boat while the others hide from suddenly appearing attacking eagles. But Clint is bitten by a cottonmouth that poisons him, and he ultimately drowns and dies. Jenny, his wife, is able to see this from a balcony at the house, and she tries to go save him, but she's attacked by a snapping turtle. Once Pickett and Karen realize that Jenny's missing and Clint's boat is left floating adrift, they decide that they have to leave with Clint and Jenny's kids. This leaves Jason alone with his dog after he gets mad at Karen for leaving him on the one day that he has his family together at the plantation. So Pickett and Karen try to basically row the canoe out to Clint's boat, but they get snagged on something, and Pickett has to fight back snakes in the water while also trying to get them freed from whatever they're stuck on. And Karen and the kids are... So Pickett, Karen, and the kids are ultimately picked up after they end up getting freed from that. And the lady driving the car says she's headed for Jefferson City. And she also says that she's been driving for 3 hours, and this is the first time that she's seen anyone or any cars on the road for at least an hour. The kid riding with his mom, who she just picked up at camp, shows them a giant frog that he found at the camp, implying that this is pretty much happening everywhere. That night, at Jason's plantation house, the frogs are busting in through the windows. Jason's dog is whining and scared, and he's freaked out sitting there alone in the dark. On top of that, the phone, which had been, and still is, dead, begins to ring. He eventually is scared into having a heart attack, and the frogs end up covering his body completely as he lies dead in his house. Well, let's get to the three things that I like about 1972's frogs. First up, I kind of love how ugly and hateful the Crockett family really kind of is in terms of being human beings. The only one who is at all redeemable is Karen, the Joan Van Ark character. The rest of them only really want to be around the old man at the plantation because they want to stay in the will. There is a bit of sympathy that the audience could have for the old crotchety Jason Crockett. I mean, he plans a big deal for his birthday and for the 4th of July because, as he says, that's really about the only thing he has left to celebrate. He's been in a wheelchair, his family doesn't really want to visit him too often, and they all kind of act like assholes anyway. Now, granted, he's an asshole too, but you can kind of sympathize with him a little bit there. Jason's daughter, Iris, is kind of a ditz. Iris's husband always wants his sons, Kenneth and Michael, to man up and beat Clint at something athletic. Clint basically peaked in high school and college as an athletic star. He's constantly drunk now. He hits on Kenneth's girlfriend, Bella, constantly right in front of his wife. And his wife, Jenny, is the perfect example of a woman who needs little helpers. Sam walks into this horrible family situation, and, when Iris bitches about paying to, cut back on air pollution, Joan Van Ark says they come off as the ugly rich. And Sam, being in this situation, also kind of hates how Jason Crockett just wants to poison everything that bothers him in nature. When Iris brings up the whole thing about having to do something to the windmills that she and her family kind of run as a business, and Jason says, well, that's to help with air pollution. But then on the other side of that, on the other hand, he also wants to basically pesticide everything to oblivion, obviously leading to other types of pollution. It's kind of interesting. But at least Jason corrects Joan Van Ark when she talks about them being the ugly rich. And he says that they are indeed the ugly rich. And it's also implied that the Crockettts were pretty bad back in the days of slavery and the days of the Southern Rebellion. So it just generally works well as a movie to have this family that you kind of don't mind seeing nature get the best of. Second, I like that this movie is full of different types of animals doing the revenge on this family poisoning their territory. It's not just frogs. I mean, there are a lot of frogs, but we've got all sorts of other animals getting in on the people killing. We have tegus asphyxiating a guy, tokay geckos crawl over that asphyxiated dude, you got tarantulas, you have leeches and multiple types of snakes and gators. Hell, there's even a big old snapping turtle to get on the killer fun. At one point, we see crabs crawling all over Jenny after she's been killed by the snapping turtle. Frogs is a good title because that's the animal that there's the most of. But it's also kind of punchy and short as a title, frogs. But I think if it was just frogs killing everyone, the movie would kind of be dumpy and wouldn't be, that wouldn't ultimately be very threatening. All of nature is fighting back against this shitty family, and honestly against the whole world for kind of how humans have been treating it, or at least that's what is implied. But it is kind of fun when you realize that there's an actual variety of killer creatures in this movie. Third, generally speaking, I really do like this movie as a whole. I mean, I mentioned the family dynamic in my first like. I mentioned the variety of beasties getting murderous in the second like. But generally, this movie is pretty well done. It's a few steps above the Food of the Gods that we talked about last week. It's a little bit of a small-scale movie where you have a family being mostly focused on with a single outsider instead of a disparate group of people kind of thrown together into a story. However, there are questions left open in the movie. We never saw what happened to the trio of black characters. We don't know what their fate. Once Clint discovers that his boat is adrift, we don't see what happens to Bella, Maybelle, and Charles. The last two are Jason's maid and butler, respectively. They run away from the flock of eagles and behind the tree, never to be seen again. 10 years later, of course, they would have been the first people killed in a slasher movie because, unfortunately, they were the black characters in the cast. But also, you don't really know, but you can kind of guess that the frogs are a little bit of a harbinger or a plague that is affecting everything, everyone, everywhere. And yeah, I mean, it is kind of a plague, isn't it? Humans poison the earth that the animals live off of, and they're going to fight back. And the first thing we see are a massive horde of frogs that are kind of leading this. This movie wasn't particularly well received, but I do think it's actually one of the better creature features of this type. It's simple and has some fairly effective moments. I think it does make for a pretty darn solid 90 minutes of fun nature versus man business. Now, one more thing I do want to bring up before we bring this in for a landing. All the promotional stuff for this movie was known for having a frog with a human hand sticking out of its mouth. It's on the poster, it was on a lot of the press materials that was given out for the movie, and so forth. It's kind of a striking image to go along with that title. Yes, none of the frogs are big enough to eat a person, this is true. However, to punctuate this movie, at the very end of the credits, there is a cartoon frog hopping onto the screen with a hand sticking out of its mouth. It turns to the audience, then gobbles up the hand, licks its lips, and hops off like it's a Looney Tunes cartoon with sound effects and everything. Again, it's a fun moment, completely unnecessary, and kind of undercuts how the movie took itself seriously at what's going on. But a way to kind of lighten the mood a bit after you watched essentially a horror film. So that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday afternoon at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure Podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new review articles every Friday morning. Come back next time as Monster Mondays gets a little bit of hired help in the form of a mysterious nanny in William Friedkin's supernatural druid horror film, The Guardian. Until next week, stay spooky.